Please welcome to the stage former Young and Rubicam CEO Peter Georgescu and MSNBC anchor Ali Velshi.
To those of you who were here last night, we had a remarkable conversation, and as a result of that, Peter's going to perform and sing all of his answers. The one similarity tonight to last night's conversation is that some people in this room, particularly if you are shareholders, might get a little uncomfortable because Peter's got ideas about how we need to rethink capitalism. And it's a conversation that, Peter, you know, I have a lot on TV because a lot of my viewers are kind of angry with the role that business has played or the absence of business in important discussions. And I always have to remind my viewers that I'm actually a capitalist because we're in this world where either you believe in unfettered free markets or you are a socialist. And I remind people that not only am I a capitalist, but I come from a place in Canada where capitalism works quite well, but we also have subsidized education and universal health care, and nobody thinks of themselves as a socialist in Canada. But you start from a premise about being concerned about how businesses should be structured or what business should do. And one wonders, in this world in which we exist, where there are challenges to democracy, there are challenges to voting rights, there are challenges around COVID, why are we worrying about business this morning?
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Congratulations to Citizen and Comcast. Thank you for doing all this. And most importantly, to Ali Velshi, guys. He deserves a big hand.
Thank you.
Because he's an amazing guy. So business. Why business? Why are we bothering about business? Well, I look around this room and I suspect that many of you either are or have been part of the 80 million plus people in this country who work. So business is society. That's who we are. And we are created not to make the shareholders rich, but to make society better, to make it easier for people to have a better standard of living. That's why business got created to start with. So we are an essential part of what life, prosperity, and in fact, very much liberty is all about, isn't it? Because we can help contribute to that, or must contribute to that goal. And there's an economics part of this thing, because sometimes we think, well, government should fix this, government should fix that, government should do something else. But the reality is, for most of us in society, it is business that drives prosperity, not government. Government has about $5 or so trillion a year in terms of the amount of money they spend in society. For the next couple of years, business will go somewhere close to $25 trillion annual contribution to the economy. So just think about that. And most of the money for government, it's all pretty much spent on education, on military, on Social Security and Medicare and so forth. So it is up to us of business to really contribute and drive this prosperity. And so business is critical. If business doesn't do it, then we're in trouble as a society. And as we'll talk as the morning progresses, just what is the role of business specifically in 2022 America, and how do we get there?
And to that point, there are roles that business can play. We've seen certain examples of them in some of our social political upheavals in the last few years. We've seen moments where businesses have come into places like Indiana or North Carolina and said, you've got laws that you're passing that seem to be unfair, and we're going to cease doing business with you. We've seen some of it, not a whole lot of it, but we've seen some of it with respect to these voter challenges, the challenges to people's right to vote. But ultimately, it comes down to what you think the role of a business is. And there are competing narratives, not one that is capitalism, one that is socialism. There are competing narratives within capitalist societies. And one holds that the shareholder is the owner, and that all benefit must accrue to the shareholder, and that is the responsibility of the corporation. The other one holds that there are plenty of stakeholders, from workers to clients to the economy to the city in which you exist, and that the corporation exists to ensure satisfaction around all of those stakeholders. Now, these are both capitalism, but they're polar opposite views of what capitalism is.
Yeah, I think I want to tip my hat off to capitalism, first of all. I'm also capitalist, just like you, Ali, and I suspect maybe all of you. And if you're not capitalist, you should be capitalist. Because what we have seen in the world today is the fact that capitalism is by far the best driver of prosperity and growth that humankind ever invented. That's a fact. We've seen other experiments in socialism, communism, whatever. They don't work. Capitalism does. But what is not understood, that, as Ali was saying, capitalism comes in different flavors. And let me spend, if I may, just a second to define what capitalism really, how it works or what it is. It's a system where a company, let's take an individual company, has access to all kinds of resources, people resources, financial resources, most importantly, supply chain, a sustainable supply chain, and any resources that any individual industry requires. And then it employs some principles like prudent risk-taking, like intelligent use of rewards and incentive, and importantly, investing wisely in research and development annually and in basic research. When those conditions exist, it's like a climate environment, the good climate that all kinds of things, plants grow, everything happens. That's how capitalism works. And it works in different parts of the world. By the way, these conditions is like an inanimate machine. You have it there, it happens. There's no ethics or morality about it. None. It's just this thing that just happens. And then on top of that, you have to have something I call governance, which is what are the rules of the road and who benefits from this beautiful machine's value creation. Okay? And that's where we get the differences. That's where the variety comes across. What kind of capitalism? In China, the benefit goes to shareholders and mostly to the Communist Party. And by God, it works for them. But it's capitalism that drives the engine. In the northern countries, as we sometimes think of them as socialists, they're not. They're capitalism. But they give money to the state in order to provide, like in Canada, the free medical care and free education and other things. That's their thing. And other parts of Europe do the same thing. In America, if you go to 1945 after the war, which is the birth of really modern capitalism, from 1945 to 1982 or so, we had a version of multiple stakeholders. It was, first of all, the customer. And by the way, you start with the customer. If you don't take care of the customer, nothing good happens. Then you have the workers, the shareholder, of course, importantly, the communities. Those were the four major stakeholders that drove America to become the number one most dominant force in the world. And during this period of time, America also built the largest economic center, which was America's middle class. Phenomenal success for 40 years. It was this version of capitalism, multiple four stakeholders. And then things began to change. In 1982 or so, thereabouts, there was kind of a coup made by business leaders at the time and owners, and very much collaborated with the government at the time. And you have a new governance takes place. Now all the stakeholders go away except for the shareholder. And this is what Ali was talking about, shareholder primacy. And that morphed into a mantra that every CEO today knows what they have to do. Maximize short-term shareholder value. That's the law. And if you don't understand that as a CEO, you're out of there pretty fast. In fact, it's very hard to do. That's why the CEO tenure nowadays is under 4 years. So it's very difficult to maximize short-term shareholder value when nobody else matters really except the shareholder.
So other good things could be happening with your company, but short-term shareholder value
That's it.
is the mantra. And for most companies, one of the things that has driven us since the 80s is how to produce goods at the lowest possible cost. And so for most companies, while we'd like to think about workers as stakeholders, they are in fact a cost center to be managed and to be kept as low as possible. And right now we're having this weird thing in America where there's some kind of a worker renaissance going on, where workers are finding the ability to push wages a little bit higher, and they are punished for doing so. Companies are punished when that happens. The market doesn't celebrate a company that just announced that it's raising its wages, but that's what has to happen to keep workers. So this concept of workers and corporations as adversaries goes away in your model of capitalism.
Yeah, well, you see, I think it's very wise to focus on the workers. The Great Resignation is a misnomer. It's just absolutely ridiculous. It's really the Great Rebellion. People are all angry. Now, sure, for a little bit of time, there were some extra money for the government. That's all gone. But the problem continues. And you know, the one thing about the pandemic, it changed all of us. Let me tell you, none of us are exactly the same as we were in 2019 and before. We were confronted for the first time with the kind of impact on our mental well-being and our physical well-being. We all, including the young people particularly, terrifying to think about mortality. When you're young in the teens and 20s and 30s, or maybe most of the 40s, you're immortal. That's for the grandparents. They go somewhere else, whatever the hell they choose to go to, right? Now all of a sudden they're seeing a different world, and we are seeing the immediacy of what's possible to any of us. So we're all changed emotionally, in many ways health-wise, and some of us financially, because it was a devastating thing. And again, devastating for most of America, where the inequality in this country is for real. So about 70% of America is in serious trouble. And the rest of us, we're the fortunate ones. But everybody has been changed. So we now are looking at, as workers are, many of these 80 million people are looking and say, my goodness, my job was tough. It was very tough. I was a truck driver, and I was made to drive for 14 hours straight. That's brutal for very little money. So they're saying, enough. Life isn't worth doing that just to stay alive. And I'll find other things in what is called in economics, the gray economy, where you don't pay taxes, but you do odd jobs and you do things, you make a living, but at least you're in control of that. So that's what the Great Resignation, at the heart of it, is really all about. And people don't feel that they really matter as people or even as workers. They are cost center because that's what they have become over time. And it's very unfortunate. And the losers are society in general, and also the businesses, and even the shareholders. The shareholders don't get the full benefit of what a corporation is if the workers are not treated well.
So once you've broken the wall and you've established the fact that it's not just shareholders, but you include workers, at that point, you've opened your mind to the idea that it could be it's workers, it's the places in which you exist, it's the environment, it's social good, it's justice, it's equality, it's democracy. It gets you into the right frame of mind. But you write about two senators, it's real testimony, or real stuff that they've said, two American senators who articulate the role that companies should have and this concept of shareholder primacy. And it's like last night, Eddie Glaude talking about the 1965 debate between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley. Polar opposites. Again, within the concept of capitalism, there are people who fundamentally believe that if people listen to you and depart from the idea of shareholder primacy, it is possibly against the law to do so, and definitely detrimental to business and the health of corporate America.
Yeah. It's a total misnomer, totally misunderstanding. It's fundamentally wrong. Multiple stakeholder capitalism is a good idea, importantly from a business perspective, not because it's a morally right thing to do, which may be, in fact, it is, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because in fact, stakeholder capitalism is the only form of capitalism that can survive in a democracy. It's not sustainable to have a small portion of the population, of society, do so well as we shareholders, who today own, let's say, 10% of us own 84% of the value of the stock market. And we get 91 or so percent of the operating profits of the corporations. I mean, it's at the end of the day, that's just not sustainable. And so we have to rethink the notion of how business produces its value and what is the value of the various individuals, what's the role of the various people in society. And that's why we really have to understand that the shareholder over time is better off if, in fact, all the various stakeholders that Ali mentioned, from the planet, we won't be around if we don't take care of this greater home of ours. That's where we live, on the planet. And think about this tornado that happened in Louisville that you saw, that devastation, that's horrific. No tornado ever in American history or the world history operated the way it did. That to stay for that 130, 40 miles on top of it, that's not what tornadoes usually do. So there's a new force in the ecosystem that it's hard to imagine that it wasn't created by the current climate change problem that confront us. So we have all kinds of issues like that we have to worry about. The corporation itself needs to be taken care of. And it isn't. Under shareholder primacy, not only do you milk the workers, you also starve the corporation itself by and large. And if you are thinking, well, what's he talking about? Look at Google, look at Microsoft, look at Costco. They're successful. So what is this? Well, you know why? They're successful because they violate shareholder primacy. Those companies pay their people very well. They really do. They take care of their people. They motivate their people. They take care of the customers. They invent like crazy. You may or may not like Amazon. But for 7 years, Bezos said to the financial market, if you don't like the way I'm not giving you profits at all, but I'm growing sales and I'm building a company for the future. If you don't like me, go sell the shares. I don't care. It took 7 years, no profits. And so until he built a company that beat that bejesus out of the competition, because he had an idea and he executed and he used the resources, the right thing, the right investment for the long term. That's what all these other companies do. And when Costco, the toughest business in the world, lowest margins of any business, discount retailers. And what did he do when he started? This is a fellow called Jim Senegal. He went over and hired from other retailers their people, their best people, and said, you know what? You're terrific. We're going to double your salary to come work for me. And I want you to do two things. I want you to take care of my customers. I want them to come back. And I want you to take care of my suppliers, because I want them to give us the best products. That's your job is. And you're going to make a lot of money. And since 1982, they've compounded at 16% growth in returns of a year because they took care of their people. And they do it today. And so do Delta Airlines we're talking about. People who fly around learn to appreciate companies like Delta. Guess what? They were the only airline in the last decade or so that had a profit sharing, because they believe in taking care of their people. So back to the shareholder. The shareholder is the winner on this thing. So that's a good thing. So we have to think about Mr. Ford. Remember Mr. Ford? Mr. Ford raised the salaries for these people. Why? So they can afford to buy his products, his cars. So society, right now, the growth of GDP is mostly in the hands of the 20 or so, 25% of the people, where the rest of the people really don't contribute to the growth organic growth of GDP. Imagine if we have another 20, 30%, 40% of America contribute to society in really organic, dramatic increase in growth would be phenomenal for all of us. So stakeholder capitalism is smart business. And over time, the winners are going to be the shareholders as well.
There's a distinct overlap. I remember in my early days as a financial reporter when we talked about fund managers who invested in companies that practiced some of what you're talking about. It wasn't as evolved back then, but there were these concepts about being good places to work and not investing in things that are not suited to the values of the investor. And so many fund managers would come on my show and say, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our investors in order to get them the greatest return. Nobody back then was making the connection between the two. But since then, there have been endless lists that have been published. You actually have been part of an operation to demonstrate that companies that do take a broader view of their stakeholders do not suffer. It used to be thought that they would suffer for doing that in the same way that being green in your energy consumption was going to cost you more. And now we're realizing that's not actually true.
No, it isn't. It isn't true at all. It doesn't work. And again, it's a lack of understanding. It's a misunderstanding, including by the vast number of the shareholders. And particularly many of the people in the financial community really misunderstand the fact that the shareholder is not the owner of the company to start with. When a company went public, they gave away the right to own. They're not the owners. For God's sake, the owners don't come into a business when they want and leave when they want, and they can own it for nanoseconds, which shareholders do today. That's all. They're not owners. They own shares. They own a share of the profits of the company, but they don't control the company. A corporation owns its own assets. That's what incorporation means as a public company. And they got benefits. They got limited liability. Nothing that happens in a company bad affects the shareholders. They come and go. They're not owners, either literally or legally. They're not owners. They own a share of the company. And they deserve to get a share of the company. And they deserve to have the company run successfully. That's why they put their money in there. But so do the workers, their stakeholders. So do the customers. And so over time, you have to earn trust, importantly, from the customer. And this is what's happening in today's time. The public, the consuming public, wants to believe and trust the corporation that they're doing the right thing. And if they do the right thing, things work fine. And they sell, people come and buy the company and so forth, buy their products and services. But if the corporation doesn't do a lot of things, increasingly what we're going to see, the customer gets disenchanted and the companies are going to lose out in the long term.
Larry, are you getting up because you think it's time for us to take some questions? I'm beginning to figure you out. Yes. I mean, because you know, I can go on for several hours on this conversation. It's nuanced and it's really interesting, but I want to, let's see what people have to say about it. No, there's a lot of hands up.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can you hear me? Is this on?
What'd you do?
Is this good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Hi, Brian Gordon. As a fellow capitalist, so as a fellow capitalist and an honest capitalist, I recognize that, you know, one of the abject failures of capitalism is the medical sector. That we're now spending 18% of the gross national product on the medical industry, on insurance companies, which add almost nothing to the equation of delivering services, and a healthcare, pharmaceutical industry that doesn't recognize the power of fruits and vegetables and healthy eating. So do you have, I mean, in order to fix this and repair this, do you have ideas about how we can slay portions of capitalism that really don't meet the needs of people?
It's a very good example that he uses, because America spends more per capita on healthcare than any other OECD country by multiples, without, generally speaking, better outcomes. There are certain categories in America where outcomes are better, but in most of them, including the ones that mostly kill people, heart disease and diabetes, we don't have better outcomes than other OECD countries.
Yeah. Well, it's all true. The outcomes for Americas as a society are dismal. We're in the bottom of the developed world in terms of outcomes, longevity, mortality rates, particularly for women, and devastatingly for African American women. It is a travesty. Now, I'm not sure we have met, maybe because maybe most of the folks here may think that we have met because I was vice chairman of one of the largest hospitals in New York City. And so I'll tell you, times are changing. One of the most important things that we care about is the patient. We are a very successful, the #1 hospital in the New York area and one of the best in the country. And that came about when we put the patient first. The patient at the center of what the hospital is about. It used to be the doctors, no mas. The doctors serve the patient. All of us, directors, trustees of hospitals, serve the patient. We're there to help the patient. So now increasingly and importantly in New York Presbyterian Hospital, I'm talking about a very specific thing. Prevention is becoming one of the most important things that we do. Not just fix the problem, but begin to anticipate what it takes to stay healthy. And so I think there's a revolution going on in healthcare, and it has to begin to happen, where we think about the wellness notion of well-being. So again, the customer matters. You see, this is again capitalism in many very ways. We have to look at the person as a whole, and you matter as a person. You're not just there, whether it's a for-profit hospital or not-for-profit hospital, doesn't matter, but it's all in the service of a stakeholder called of the patient. That's the #1 customer of the hospital. And we have to take care of the rest of the employees, the doctors and the nurses. What can we do? What would have happened without the nurses and frontline workers in this pandemic? I mean, they were heroic people. So all the hospitals and so forth are learning how to care, the thing that we have learned for a long time, for many, many, many decades. You take care of your people. You invest in better science. The amazing entrepreneurship of America. The entrepreneurship comes from people who worry about their business. They wake up in the middle of the night to care, what am I going to do tomorrow morning to drive the business? Why? Because they participate in the growth. And that's what capitalism is about. I'm sorry to come back to capitalism, but that's the nature of where we should be going. We need to compete with China, right? How are we going to do that? If we don't invest in the people, we invest in the companies, invest in new systems, and invest in new things. Vaccines, for God's sakes. In a matter of months, we created something that is so heroic, so fantastic. Otherwise, this pandemic would have been in the dozens of millions of people dying in this country, let alone around the world. So I am totally agreeing with you, and I think we have to take the unproductive middle, whatever it is, out increasingly and streamline the way healthcare works to reduce costs. It's unacceptable for us to have the kind of costs that exist today as a burden to the American people.
It's also one of those few industries that we have that has a perverse incentive. And we need to reverse that, as most developed countries have done. When your incentive is correct in healthcare, you don't have these extra middles because you can't compete when you're at 18% of GDP compared to, look at Canada. I think we're 3 times what Canada pays for healthcare. Is it the best healthcare system in the world? I don't know, but everybody gets it. So,
yeah.
We got one more over here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I think I am now officially a stakeholder capitalist.
Bravo.
There we go.
Give him a hand.
We stole an idea. I love it. There should be a bell for every time the idea gets stolen.
Absolutely. So my question is, first of all, great perspective. My question is really centered around the fact that even in a capitalistic model, business and government have to work together. And so with that said, can you talk a little bit about how government or the role of business is in working with government to kind of address some of the institutional things that exist that keep someone like me or someone who's a stakeholder, capitalist, from really seeing things in an equitable way? Because I believe that our institutions are designed, some of the major institutions, whether it be criminal justice or health, as we talked about healthcare, et cetera, they're very structured, could be revisited and perhaps redesigned to be more equitable. So if you could talk about that.
Brilliant. I mean, when you talk about perverse incentives, our criminal justice system is one big perverse incentive that is a shareholder capital industry now in this country.
And it shouldn't be that.
It shouldn't be at all.
That's the one place that capitalists should not exist. I'm so glad that you brought up that question. I really am appreciative of that because, look, business must drive benefits to society, and business and government collaborating together are the most powerful force in the world. It's ridiculous for us to think about being antagonistic to each other. Now, government has a very important role to regulate, to make sure that business operates fair and square by the rules, by the laws, absolutely an essential role by the government. But they also can collaborate. Let me give you back to the healthcare area. No company, individual pharma, could invest $40 billion 25, 30 years ago when the genome was decoded. No company could do that because nobody knew that there was such a thing as decoding the genome. So how can you lay out $40 billion that you didn't know that was possible? But governments could, and they did invest $40 billion, and it was decoded, and then businesses came along and monetized on that extraordinary investment. The same as the government, when the first person went to the moon, it was government invested through NASA in that. And then industries after industry was built on the back of that investment. So there are plenty of examples of how government and business can collaborate. And today it's called AI. The reason we don't have 5G and we're not the leaders in AI anymore, because China is because we didn't invest in the businesses in AI and in things like 5Gs. And now we better get our act together and do that. And again, it requires collaboration between government and business. And we, by the way, in terms of this is a really nitty-gritty thing, right? Depreciation, so you can spread the cost of business over years. That's what we do to machines. Well, what about people? Why don't we spend the money training people and get the benefit of that? Examples how government and business can work together.
We're about out of time, but I want to plug Peter's book, Capitalists Arise, and also ask you, Peter, as a go-away question. So as you're the former chairman of and CEO of Young Rubicam, as you mentioned, former chair of New York Presbyterian. What is the reaction to you're as radical as Stu from last night, but you just dress differently.
Gee, I don't play the guitar.
I know, if you had a guitar, that'd be perfect.
I apologize.
What is the reaction?
It's a good point, because this is a radical view. It shouldn't be, but it's a radical view in the world in which he operates.
Yeah, so that's my question, is what has been the reaction from your fellow one percenters to your evangelizing for stakeholder capitalism?
Well, there's some good news and some news. The good news is that many corporations, many of the successful corporations in America do exactly what I was talking about. And that's why they're successful in today's world. I mentioned a whole bunch of them. Not only the big technology companies that clearly get it, because that's how they got there. That's how they stay there. You don't stay there if you don't continue to innovate. And who does the innovation? Remember, it's people. People do the innovation, not the CEOs. So big companies really do that. So they get it, many of them get it, But listen, change is hard. Any change is hard. And people think mistakenly that the shareholders are going to be a loser somehow if multiple stakeholder gets placed. And that's just a misinterpretation.
Demonstrably false.
Demonstrably false.
Yeah.
And it's lack of education, it's myth, it's tradition, it's all this stuff that makes us as human beings, we're all scared of change. And I say it's time for us to embrace change. And you know what's at stake? It's democracy in America. Mm-hmm. If we don't really enfranchise all the people and take care of us as people, we're going to be in trouble. And right now we're confronted with those kind of issues, and business needs to play its role and its part. And by the way, I'm an immigrant. Off-the-boat immigrant. I came here when I was 15 years old from a communist country. I spent 5 years there as a political prisoner, working, cleaning sewers and digging ditches. So I understand what oppression is about. Mm-hmm. And I lived life in America, and I've lived the American dream. I want that for my 4 granddaughters and every child and grandchild and every future American. That's what I want for America, the best that we can be.
That's perfect.
So I'm all for it. Thank you, Larry.
Peter, that was outstanding. There's much more of this conversation to have. I would recommend, as a fellow capitalist, reading Peter's book. It is, while it seems radical to some people who will be sitting there, it's actually quite straightforward and understandable, and I think it's worth us thinking about and putting pressure on our companies, those companies in which we hold shares, and our governments to say, let's rethink this. So thank you for your amazing conversation.
You. And Larry, thank you for having me. Thank you.